letters around an initiative calling on the government to make new investments in gender-responsive, resilient food systems to the tune of $2 billion. You heard Amar talk about how important it is to provide access and opportunity and resources to women. And that is what we are trying to get more attention on. 2 billion might sound like a lot, but in today's world, that really isn't. It's really just a touch. Globally, we are part of Hungry for Action, which is a campaign coordinated by the Sustainable Development Advocacy Hub and supported by 40 organizations. This campaign involves sending an open letter to world leaders calling for a meeting on the global food crisis and challenging them to avert famine and provide lasting and coordinated solutions to heal this food system that is in crisis, really. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and public conversations like this is part of this work. So thank you all so much for coming out to engage in this conversation with us.
It's so lovely to hear you all talking about food security as like a sort of like symptom, like as a sort of this like phantom phenomena that really is only exists downstream of other structural inequities, and that food security and hunger, like, you know, can't be achieved unless there are other meaningful, like, systemic inputs and reforms. And so I guess I wanted to ask, like, starting, you can start this time. And also I think you're the perfect person to begin speaking to this, at least for my personal benefit as somebody who spends so much of their time focused, like, you know, locally and nationally. This bigger picture is frankly newer to me. And so my question is, you know, from my vantage point, again, when I started in 2019, we were getting at Amazon 150 applications every year. That's now doubled. That, you know, the number of food insecure Canadians has skyrocketed. That food costs just over the last 2 years are up 18%. You know, it seems like things are worse than they've ever been, based on all the indicators. Is that just a matter of like positionality and perception, or is that in, like, from your experience with this bird's eye view, like, are things worse? And if they actually are worse, then what is unique about the landscape now? What's changed that in this moment, so many places, so many people, so many communities all at once are struggling?
Yeah, thanks for that, Grant. It certainly is not a pie in the sky kind of situation, for sure, right? The reality is we're feeling it in our wallets and in our stomachs, right? Some more than others, of course. Yesterday, the mic doesn't work. Oh, no. Yeah. I will finish it.
Turn the volume up.
Yes. Yesterday, the United Nations World Food Program warned that over 2 million people in the country of Chad are suffering from severe food insecurity, calling the situation catastrophic. I mean, 2 million people is not a small number, right? Chad is the third least developed country in the world, meaning that people have difficulty guaranteeing 1 meal a day, right? And 1.7 million children under the age of 5 are suffering from malnutrition. You heard Amar and Amma talk a lot about the intersectionality of this issue, right? We can't talk about it in isolation. There's so many things that is impacting that, right? Whether it's climate, whether it's conflict, whether it's economic shocks, the pandemic. I mean, so many drivers that are affecting this. And the reality is that these challenges are not just in Canada, right? And I'm not saying this to minimize the hardships that we're experiencing here at home. However, the world is experiencing a global hunger crisis. It's the elephant in the room that's too often ignored and not engaged in the media. It's almost like it's not sexy enough to make headline news, right? And perhaps we need to start to reframe it as a health issue, a global health issue, for it to get different type of attention. The war in Ukraine, the pandemic, severe weather conditions, rising debt, and other invisible drivers have caused food prices to skyrocket, and food access and availability to be a whole lot more challenging than ever in our lifetime. And no matter your geographical location, we're all feeling it. Like I said, in our wallets, in our bellies, some more than others depending on where you live. How bad is it at a global level? I'll share a couple of facts with you, and I will preface what I'm sharing by saying that with crises and wars unfolding rapidly, I may not be giving you the most up-to-date information because something may have changed from this morning. I would argue that the circumstances are likely worse than what I'm about to share. And we do have a resource called data.one.org where we have up-to-date data and stats on all development issues, including this, that you guys can check out as well. But 1 in 10 people on this planet are undernourished from what our data is telling us. That's roughly 800 million people who don't have enough food, right? We all know that we need food to stay healthy and alive. And families, regardless of what your family structure is, will almost always prioritize food over other expenses. And if you can't buy food, you more than likely are struggling with other expenses, right? That's just the reality. So when a family can't afford to eat, that's a clear indication that they are in crisis, right? Number 2, the global hunger crisis is worse than ever. Every time you hear a news report, we've never seen anything like this. It is worse than the last 20 years, right? The data is there, the stats are there, the information is there, and it's persistent. You mentioned earlier that in Canada, we are doing better than a lot of places. And Canada is an affluent country, but yet we have a chronic hunger issue in Canada. So imagine countries who are not as well off as we are, right? In 2021, 193 million people were in need of urgent food assistance. When you think about that number, if that was a population, or if that population were a country, it would be the 8th largest country in the world.
No, it's staggering, and it's like I guess what I would want to into Amma and ask. So there's so many factors, right, that are playing into our current hunger crisis in this moment. It seems so like inevitable, and I think you did a really good job, Minerva, trying to like capture the extent of all of these inputs. I guess maybe not everybody in the audience is familiar with this term you used, food sovereignty. Could you talk a little bit about food sovereignty and how the food sovereignty sort of framework provides sort of an alternative to this like overdetermined, too many inputs, complex global system wherein, you know, increasing unaffordability feels like it's almost like an inevitable and inexplicable byproduct of just how things are getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I feel bad because I feel like we've been throwing a lot of numbers out this evening. So I think everybody understands how bad the situation is. We don't even need to go into that. We understand there's a crisis. And before I even answer that part of your question, but I also want us to think carefully about some of these issues in the way that we've been framing them and in the ways that sometimes it gets responded to by, you know, our government, corporations, and things like that. When we focus on nutrition, the focus is on hunger, right? Hunger is a feeling, right? You feel hungry, you are, you know, and the response when people hear that people are hungry, the response is then people need food, right? That's where a lot of public dollars and public donations and things you saw during the pandemic, right? Their communities are in crisis. What should we do? Let's give more money into food banks. You talk to any politician and you're talking to them about food security and you're talking about emergency food aid.
Yeah.
But they're using the term food security. And I remember just going crazy in front of my TV going, that's not food security.
Yeah.
People are food insecure. That's why they need food banks.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's important to acknowledge, and that's important for us to note as well. When we frame the issue as a nutrition issue, then corporation comes in with their, I don't know, now they're selling things that's like nutrient dense, whatever bars or whatever to cure the poor people in Africa, which is really just an investment for them. It's just another market opportunity for them, and it doesn't address the systemic issue that we're facing globally. So I think I think it's good for us to note on that. And I have to share another statistics in terms of how, and in response to your question, you know, the industrial, and you shared some of it too when you were giving your intro. Industrial commercial agriculture, right, is what is aggravating climate change. How? It's responsible for 80% of global deforestation, up to 27 of global green gas emissions, 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss, 50% of freshwater biodiversity loss, of agricultural land, 52% is degraded, and agriculture accounts for 70% of fresh water use. I think that's important to think about it, and then I'll go into why agroecology and why at SeedChange we believe that is the way that we need to move forward as a society. And most importantly, why feminist agroecology? Because as I mentioned before, it's women. It's the women out there who are growing the food, who are protecting our biodiversity, and they are the ones we don't see, the ones we don't hear about, the ones who are not making the news, the ones we don't invite to the policy table to make decisions. So when we say agroecology, what does that mean? And agroecology is political, but it's also a science, and it's also a practice. And I think it's important to understand that. One of the hallmarks of agroecology is local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, first and foremost. Indigenous communities, indigenous people in your communities know more about the land than you could ever know. I use my grandmother as an example. I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with my grandmother. The way she understands the soil, the land that she wants, the food that she grows, and how she grows it, it's incredible. She doesn't speak English, she doesn't know how to write. She will never ever be able to sit at any decision-making table on any of these issues because she is deemed illiterate and therefore unintelligent. But she holds so much knowledge. So I think when we talk about agroecology, we're really looking at, you know, how we grow our food. Because if you look at the numbers that I just shared on terms of what the industrial agriculture, the commercial agriculture is doing to the planet and is doing to our climate, you understand that we do need to shift, and I think there's an urgency. We think that the heat waves, the floods, all of this, it's all man-made. We are causing it, and we can change the way that we do things for the future. So agroecology is really looking at the practice of how we grow food and making sure that we're growing food in an ecological way, but it's also political. And it's a political stance against the corporate control and the corporate capture of our food. To really make sure that, you know, farmers have that first and foremost control. If you look at the numbers in terms of how many farmers are in debt in Canada and in the States, is astronomical. 95% of revenue that's associated with agriculture, so we're talking transportation, fertilizers, equipment, land, everything, all goes to corporations, which make up just a handful, like maybe 5 corporations make 95%. Family farmers, the ones who actually feed us, they only get 5% of that revenue. And that should be alarming for all of us. But I think time and time again, we're told that it's the corporate sector that feed us, and we know that that's not true, right? So it's like, how do we shift that narrative and that conversation to really focus on the real causes and look for ways forward? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. The background right at the beginning, just situating this conversation, I think really, really helpful. Omar, I want to turn to you. Like thinking about this tension between the right to food approach and the sort of commodification and corporatization of food systems. I guess, how do we navigate those things, and to what extent do you see that tension as being the driving force behind this, like global and also local, like food security crisis?
So I think that's obviously that's a great question, and I think it goes back to systemic causes. Excuse me. What are we talking about, in terms of food insecurity? Why are people hungry? Why do people come to the food bank? And at Daily Bread, we really like to focus on 3 strategic priorities. One, the largest one being income support. We know that research tells us that the reason why people the reason why people come to food bank is because they simply do not have enough money to buy the food that they need, or the housing costs are too high. So in Toronto, we know that this is like the unaffordable housing mecca, people, and unfortunate reality, but we know that the majority of people who come to food banks are spending most, if not all of their income on housing. And I can share some stats with you in the Who's Hungry report from last year, that nearly 1 in 5 food bank clients spends 100% or more of their income on housing. So they have nothing left. And I can tell you that the average food bank client has about $8 left per person per day after they pay their shelters and utility costs. So imagine this, you only have $8 per person per day to transportation, to get food, to get your medicine, get your clothes. It's impossible. If you take a round trip on TCC, it's like what, $6.50? You only have $1.50 left. Can anybody survive on $1.50 a day in Toronto? That's impossible. So we look at, our approach mostly is looking at like the strategic priorities of income support, affordable housing, and decent work. And I can tell you that, again, in this report from last year, one third of food bank clients have a job. So this idea that people can simply go to school, get a job, and they're protected against food insecurity is not true anymore. And this is because we're living in an inflationary environment. So we really try to look at the systemic causes. We try to look at, what are we doing today? And I told Grant this earlier just before the panel started. At Daily Bread, we fight hunger today and we try to prevent it tomorrow. Because we know that if we focus our advocacy on the systemic causes, affordable housing and income support, people do not have to come to the food bank anymore. People do not have to rely on charity to live a dignified life. And this is, as mentioned earlier, the right to food. What does that mean, the right to food? It means people are able to get the food they need without having to rely on charity. And this is why we say governments are the duty bearers of that right. Governments must realize the right to food, so food banks don't have to exist. So to going back to that question of the interplay between the food industrial complex and the corporatization of food, absolutely. We talk about our Daily Bread. We like this year has been a record year for us, and unfortunately in a lot of bad ways, because we pushed out 28 million pounds last year. This is an average of about 500,000 pounds a week of food. So when you look at the scale of the crisis that we're facing, but then you look at where are the donations coming from, right? I mentioned earlier we receive no government funding, but I can tell you that half of our donations come from corporations. I can tell you that the other half comes from individuals, philanthropy, and community foundations. And there's always this idea or this concept that the food industrial complex is to blame for the food insecurity or the food crisis we're facing. And I think a part of that is true because you look at, for example, employers who don't pay a decent living wage. We have employers who don't pay a decent living wage, and then they turn around and say, you know what, I'm gonna donate X amount of money to the food bank because I care about people in my community. Well, maybe if you care about people in your community, you should pay them a living wage so they don't have to come to our door. You have people, those, and to anyone who's invested in a real estate investment trust, no offense here, but we have real estate investment trusts who buy up affordable housing stock, especially in the city of Toronto, and I won't name these developers. They buy up the affordable housing stock, they renovate them, they evict people, and they jack up the prices. And then they turn around and say, hey, we want to donate X amount of money to the food bank because we care about our neighbors. Well, if you care about your neighbors, maybe you shouldn't evict them in the first place. Yeah. People who come to us and tell us, hey, I simply have no money for food because my landlord just jacked up my rent. My landlord just applied for an above guideline increase. My landlord had just evicted us, reno-evicted, demo-evicted, all the evictions. So it's really unfortunate because, as a food bank, we have a duty to people today to make sure that they can get food. And we can't compromise that because if we don't operate, then I can tell you right now that nearly 300,000 people in the city of Toronto rely on food banks. That's almost 1 in 10. 1 in 10 people in Toronto rely on food bank. And the fact that so many people come to food bank means that we have to make sure that everybody has at least 3 days worth of food when they come to the food bank. And I can just say something at the food bank, at Daily Bread, and any of our member agencies, we do not income test. We do not means test. Anyone can walk into any of our food bank locations and get the 3 days worth of food that they need. Now, some agencies may have like catchment areas where if you don't live in a certain boundary, but they're not asking you for your income. And I can say that in a time of crisis like this, a lot of organizations across the country, or a number of organizations across the country, other food banks, which I don't want to name, but on the West Coast, on the East Coast, sorry, on the West Coast, on the East Coast, I'm talking like in Canada, have started to income test people. So you show up at certain food banks, again, that I won't name, not in Toronto, and they will ask you, how much are you making? And if you're making more than what they deem, you will be refused food. So for us at Daily Bread, because we believe in the rights-based approach, dignity, the idea that when you show up, like the idea that someone has to come to you and ask for food, that is like someone who is in dire assistance. So we never income test, and something else that we've been doing in our food bank is a shopping model. Food bank, this idea that you show up, you get a hamper of food, and you're out the door. It does exist, it still exists, but we don't do that. We replicate a shopping model. You walk in, you get a certain amount of points, and you get to choose the food that you want. 2 reasons. One, when you get a hamper and half of it is food that you don't even know or use, and I think my colleagues over here can talk about this literacy, like this knowledge about like, what is this plant? How do I cook it? What do I do with it? I can tell you like how many people tell us, what's the rutabaga? Like, I don't know how to cook that, and even I don't know how to cook that. So people are just saying like, what do I do with it? When the reality is that if you offer people the choice, the agency, and the dignity to choose the food they want, you know, that is a rights-based approach. So that's where we're coming from at Daily Bread. We want to make sure that people have agency, that even if you are food insecure, you are still treated with dignity. That you still have the right to food, that you can walk in and say, you know what, I don't really like that kind of cereal, but I'm going to take this bread because I like it. Or I don't like that rutabaga, I'm going to take a pineapple or a squash or something. And I think that speaks a lot to the approach that we're trying to do. And I think on a closing note, you know, when we talk about the corporatization, I personally struggle with this myself because I have colleagues who work, you know, Daily Bread is a growing organization, unfortunately, because the need keeps growing. And I have colleagues who work in the operations department, who work in the programs and service department. They're the ones who are on the front lines. They're getting food out every day. They're making sure agencies got the food they need. And then there's people like me who work in policy and research and advocacy. And I keep thinking about the systemic, you know, causes, and I think about this, you know, like, why are we accepting money from corporations who don't pay living wages? Why are we, you know, accepting donations from grocery stores who are, you know, aggravating this cost of living crisis? And this is something that I always try to reconcile myself, and I try to, you know, address within my own organization. But I think it's really hard because people need to eat today. And I think that's the bottom line, that people need to eat today. And I think a lot of us can stand on virtue and on principle and say, you know what, no, we have to say no to these donations. But the fact is, people will go hungry. And I think what we try to do is accept these donations, but also understand that by doing the advocacy work that we do, by advocating to government for affordable housing, for decent income support, for better work, we can, you know, reach a point where one day we can tell these corporations, thanks but no thanks. We don't want your food, we don't want your donations because you're just aggravating the situation that we have.
So I think we can do this work. Yeah. You're an incredible speaker. And no notes or anything. No, I think that we can do this work and also like be like critical of the role of the nonprofit sector and the nonprofit industrial complex. Like we're doing harm reduction fundamentally, right? There are structural failures and structural inequities. We've got a threadbare social safety net and we are trying to patch it. The work that you're doing on stuff like Who's Hungry and the advocacy work that GRAN is doing, that's going beyond the sort of the sort of like rushing around, need is increasing, like government, you know, welfare programs aren't expanding to accommodate, and that gap is being, you know, the nonprofit sector rushes in to fill it, and this year I think we're over $12 billion a year, the nonprofit sector in Canada. We can't fundraise our way out of this crisis. We can't. So we need advocacy. And so at Mazon, my organization, we have been actively pivoting into advocacy. We're recruiting right now for an advocacy committee. But I want to hear more specifically from Pat about GRAN's work, because you guys you're years and years deep into this, really trying to like meaningfully make a difference. And I guess the specific question that I wanted to ask, because I'm being conscious of time and I want to make sure that there's, everybody gets, I know, I want to, this question will go to the whole panel, and then I think we're going to go to questions. But Pat, I want to hear from you first. Like, what can institutions, what can people like ourselves with institutional power, what's the best way to make a difference on this structural level? What change, tell me about like what GRAN's doing and what change you want to see other institutions that are so empowered, like organizations bigger than Mazon, organizations like Daily Bread and KIN, though I think you guys are doing the Lord's work really truly. Like what change we should be striving to make, and for like those assembled, those in the audience, when they want to make a difference, when they want to make a change on this sort of structural level, they don't have necessarily institutions behind them that they can steer in that direction. Like, what would you recommend?
Well, thanks. That's a big question, and I think as I started to say, and it gives me an opportunity to reflect on it a little bit more. I think the first thing people need to do is learn. One of the things we're dealing with now is that people are really quite unaware of how big a crisis this is. We've heard a lot of numbers tonight. I'm thinking of a number, over 800 million people globally are affected by hunger. So we've been on, as I've said, a kind of a learning journey in GRAN, and people like Amma have helped us along that journey because she's helped us to understand what is happening and what she knows from her own deep knowledge and her experience on the ground. And so we've been learning, we've been researching, we've been understanding what is happening around the world and what some of the root causes are, and people have been touching on that. And I wanted to just emphasize kind of three things that bear repeating. One is conflict in the world, the other is climate change, and the third is something we really got focused on, which is the industrial model of agriculture. And that industrial model of agriculture has huge impacts for the environment. But we've also learned in the last few years, coming to the end of the pandemic, that it is also very fragile. It requires huge inputs of fertilizers, of pesticides. It requires complex global supply chains that broke all the way down by the end of the pandemic. And so from an advocacy perspective, I wanted to dwell for a moment on the need to learn and understand. The next thing I think we really need to do is to share what we know, to share with friends and networks what we've learned about the issues, and also to share the optimism that solutions are possible. We've spent most of the time so far talking about what a difficult crisis we are in right now, but there are solutions to that crisis. And a lot of them involve what we've been kind of talking about, and that is system change. It's not just about, oh, we need to provide more money, whether we donate to a food bank or provide money through an aid organization that delivers programs overseas. We need to understand that solutions are there in the countries that are experiencing these crises, but a lot of things are standing in the way of those people putting forward those solutions. Amma has referred to them. Monopolies on seeds, which make it very difficult for people to manage their own seeds and have their own rich farms making a difference. We have learned that climate and drought are having huge impacts, and that is creating hunger and food insecurity. And people from all over the global south are advocating very hard right now for something called loss and damage through the UN system to say, we are dealing with damages that the global north, if I can call us that, has created. We are not putting out these greenhouse gas emissions. They're coming from elsewhere, and we know where that elsewhere is. And yet we are having to pick up the pieces and deal with the damage that is being created. So we need to, as advocates, I think, we need to learn. We need to better understand. We need to start sharing what we know. And we need to see that this isn't just about making a donation, although donations are important. We need to understand that system change, moving away from industrial modes of agriculture to locally based, grassroots-led. Farmers have solutions. They know what needs to be done. But we are barriers, and by we I mean our collective culture and how we do things. Those barriers are standing in the way of the achievements that they could make if only we allowed them. So one of the things we do when we advocate is we do say to the government, you need to invest in international assistance. You need to invest in climate finance. And you need to take seriously the question of loss and damage, because that is real. But we also say you need to look at the quality of how you invest. I've been reading a book called White Saviorism, and I'm very taken with some of the principles and ideas in it. And for too long, we've been in a model of, we will come over and show you how to do this right, instead of, we will get out of your way and provide investments, which frankly we owe, so that people who know what needs to be done can get on and do it.
Very good.
I'm wondering, will you think about paths forward and sort of this, like, you know, to end the structured panel portion on a more sort of like constructive note? The one that Pat struck, I think, is like a good one. That, you know, we're faced with a lot of challenges, but also there are avenues for action wherein we can start to really make a difference.
Absolutely, and I think Pat hit the nail on the head when she talked about first just educating ourselves and increasing our awareness, which is part of this conversation, but also recognizing that we have power as individuals. And at One, we like to say we don't ask for your money, we ask for your voice, because there is change that can happen when we use our voices. Pat talks about as well, you know, the advocacy piece, and what we are saying to government. We sit at a lot of different coalition tables, and what we're encouraging is a shift from the singular focus of solutions, right? Because you can't just say you're addressing nutrition only, right? Without addressing food security, without addressing climate. So we're asking for a coordinated, holistic approach. So reach out to your member of parliament. Pat mentioned earlier, they like to hear from you, they listen to, they recognize how important your voice and your votes are. And schedule a meeting with them. They hardly refuse, because again, they know it's important. They like to go to parliament and say, here's what I'm hearing from my constituents. And people listen. And so ask them about what their plan is. Challenge them to make hunger and food security a political issue, because that will help shift their focus on the matter, right? And talk to them about, well, what is your action plan to address these things? One of the things that parliamentarians or government officials are really afraid of is us holding them accountable. When they make promises and we ask them to deliver on those promises, it's not something that they publicly want to step forward and say, well, I wasn't able to do that. So in addition to learning, engage with your parliamentarian. And challenge them and demand to see what their plan is for your community, and how they're addressing these issues locally, and also what is the whole humanitarian approach to the issue as opposed to a singular issue. Omar and Amma talked a lot about that. It's the intersectionality of this issue that needs to be addressed so that the infrastructure of food systems can be reformed and reshaped to address a better global system for all of us. So we're creating a better future for our children and our grandchildren.
Something parliamentarians are really, really afraid of, and this is GRAN, so this is particularly relevant, is retirees. They're terrified of retirees. And it's not just because you guys vote, it's because you have time. So you can just, like, so I swear, yeah, but just like call them over and over again, right? Like if there's an issue, like what, like any and all of this, really, like just be especially on the municipal level, nothing happens on the municipal level. Like it is actually mind-boggling when you start to engage with the mechanics of municipal government. If there's ever anything that you want to change and you're an organized group of seniors, you can do it. Like it's really, it's unbelievable how empowered you are. Anyway, zooming back at it. Yeah, yeah.
No, definitely, and I think, you know, election is looming, right? Climate is going to be one of the major issues, but ever rarely do you hear about food and agriculture becoming an election issue. And I think one of the things that we can do is how can we push to make sure that food and agriculture is part of the election issues that is debated upon by our leaders moving forward, because it's crucial and it's needed. And I think that's, one way that we can look at addressing some of this issue. Another piece is that I work in the international sphere, so I'm going to talk more broadly about Canadians and international development work. You know, when it comes to international development work, a lot of us Canadians like to say Canada first. You know, we can't afford to do more over there unless we deal with here first. You know, our planet does not know borders, does not care for borders. Our planet does not know Canada or America or wherever. It's one planet. And as was mentioned also earlier, you know, like if we look at the continent of Africa, like the emissions is what? Less than 5% or 6%, right? But they deal with a lot of the challenges that's associated from climate change, from things that we are doing here. The comfort that we have here is at the expense of others, and I think that's always important to remember that. And I remember being at a different meeting where a funder asked me, so should we fund Canadian programs or should we fund international programs? And I'm like, you're asking the wrong question. What is the issue? And what can you do to address that issue? It's never about Canada first or another country first. It's all very much interlinked, and it does have an impact. So when it comes to international assistance, for instance, you know, international assistance in Canada have been reduced by about 15%. Yeah, that's a lot. A lot of Canadians don't know much about it. They don't really, according to our politicians, Canadians don't care, right? But it's work that is important. Dealing with climate issues in another country is also dealing with climate issues here. And in fact, a lot of the environmental movement, a lot of the food sovereignty work that we do here in North America, it's based on experiences from folks in the global south. Yeah, that we learned. So I think that protectionist mindset, you know, is something that we need to burst that bubble and think globally when it comes to climate issues and when it comes to food crisis as a way forward. You know, and to also add another sort of scary piece around when we talk about the food crisis really is around the fact that, you know, we've had food crisis upon food crisis decade after decade. Yes, the numbers look scary and it's getting worse, but sometimes it seems like these corporations like to milk it for their own good. And I'm talking about, let's start with the war in Ukraine and Russia. You know, I went to a meeting by the World Food Program where they were talking about emergency aid and sustainability. Really, they want to talk about how can we get emergency food to countries and communities that need it the most, but in a way that can build their long-term sustainability in terms of looking at food security. And guess what their answer was? you know, I heard Africa needed chemical fertilizers like yesterday. We need to make sure that they get that chemical fertilizer. Okay, maybe that's an emergency response, but that's not sustainability. Because the chemicals are going to deplete the soil. The people are going to become hungry. What happens then? So I think it's really, really important for us to think about sometimes the drivers of these crises and the solutions that they bring, which is just another investment opportunity. So let's get more chemical fertilizers. And to be honest, when it comes to seeds, when it comes to hybrid or genetically modified seeds, and when it comes to chemical fertilizers, it's always pushed as the solution to solve hunger or to solve nutrition. But studies have shown again and again that it only enriches corporations, it makes farmers poor, and it makes people hungry, and it degrades the environment. So I think there are many, many ways that we can all lend our voice to this issue in Canada and elsewhere to really make sure that food and agriculture is part of the major election issues, especially when we're talking about climate change. Thank you.
So you're left with a heavy burden to close off the panel portion of our discussion. But I'm always talking a little bit about this relationship on the level of sort of national and international, that there are these complex systems, you know, we're embedded, you know, locally, and that those have consequences and ripple out, and you can't really focus. What I'm hearing is that you can't, this idea that you focus on one thing, you know, and that you are in this crisis response mode, that's sort of, it sort of dooms you to failure.
Yeah, we need a very integrated approach in looking at, yes, the emergency needs of people, but the long-term sustainability. It has to go hand in hand, unless we just keep repeating the cycle over and over again. So a lot of resources went into emergency food for communities, you know, across Canada during the pandemic, but how much focus or how many dollars actually went into the eradication of poverty and making sure that communities can be resilient.
And I guess what I'm interested for Omar is that same dynamic, but instead of on the level of international, national, on the level of local and provincial.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of things here. One, I heard, you know, people talk about poverty, right? And talked about, you know, when we're talking to our leaders, what are we asking them for? And I think something that we always tell people is that next time you talk to your politician, ask them, what is their poverty reduction strategy? Do they even have one? So I can tell you, at the city level, there is a poverty reduction strategy, but it's not funded, so it doesn't do anything. I can tell you that at the provincial level, the only goal of the poverty reduction strategy here in Ontario, since the Progressive Conservative took power in 2018, there's only one goal for the poverty reduction strategy, is to move people off social assistance and into jobs. Now, these jobs, whatever they are, I don't know, but they're trying to modernize. They call it social systems modernization. So when you have a poverty reduction strategy that only looks at how fast you can get people off social assistance, aka OW, Ontario Works, and ODSP, Ontario Disability Support Program, this is not a good poverty reduction strategy.
And they were bragging about it because of how many people they got off social assistance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're getting so, like, we know that the caseloads are dropping for ODSP. Does this mean that there are less people with disabilities? No. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's not. That's not the case. And we really think that, like, you know, I heard this question earlier in the panel, you know, people saying, how can we get involved, right? We've been talking about issues, how can we, you know, talk about solutions? And I have two pieces of advice. One, I think, is, you know, we talk about education, right? Read the report, read the stats, you know, educate yourself, share it with your friends and your family. Yeah. Two, someone said, you know, you should call your politicians, you should talk to them, they want to hear from you. And I think that's totally valid. That's something that we do at Daily Bread. We try to mobilize people to you know, contact the city council or contact the MP. But I think as institutions here, we need to give people the tools to do that. It's not easy to tell someone to call a member of parliament. They don't know what to say. They don't know what they're supposed to be pushing. So I think when we talk about our institutional capacities, what we can do for people who work within an institution, we need to provide the tool. And I can tell you, for example, Daily Bread, we do this thing, it's like the take action tool, where you go, you pop in your name, you pop in your postal code, and it sends a letter to X politician about Y issue. Right now, we're running a campaign to get the Canada Disability Benefit funded in the next budget. That's one way. Or maybe, you run a phone bank, but you give people a script, what to say, their email. So I think that's another thing that we can do. And I think the third piece is, or my first point, is that I think we need to look around ourselves and look at our own skills and our own networks. If you're an educator, how can you educate the children in your classroom about these issues? If you're a writer, you should be writing about this stuff. You should be, getting it out to the world, writing letters to the editor, newspapers. If you are a leader, in a corporate organization, you should be, talking to your employees, talking to your colleagues. So I think all of us, I think people don't give themselves enough credit for the tools that we have. And I think if people want to make change, I think we need to look around and look at what we have at our own disposal and how we can leverage our own networks and our own skill set. And I think that's how we can turn into advocates. And the second point, I think, is framing. I've heard all my colleagues on the panel talk about it really matters how you frame an issue. And I'll give you an example of this. We've seen this with the child care agreement. We've seen this with what do you call it? Yeah, mostly with the $10 a day childcare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Advocates have been pushing for that for decades. And one of the arguments that they use all the time is that, well, this, $10 a day childcare doesn't just benefit half the population. It benefits the entire population because more people can work, more people, have money in their pockets, more people can, business. So I took that same logic and I applied it to a living wage. This idea that when you tell someone, hey, it's time to raise the minimum wage for a living wage, people are like, no. But if you frame it as a sense of like, hey, you're not just going to benefit low income and minimum wage earners, you're gonna benefit everyone. Because if everyone gets a living wage, one, businesses have less turnover. They can plan for longer. Two, people work longer because they have a living wage. They don't have to keep, looking for jobs, looking for other opportunities. They'll stay longer. Three, people have more money in their pockets to spend in the local economy. And I think the framing is really important because as advocates, if you just go in and say, well, this policy is gonna benefit this group, policymakers are gonna look at you and say, well, what's the political payoff for me, right? Why would I do this policy that's only gonna benefit 5%, 10%? But if you frame it as a policy that benefits everyone and the greater society, you'll see light bulbs go up. And I share this example because I was in a meeting with provincial minister, who when we pitched the living wage, they laughed. And then when we went back and we came back with this framing of like, wait, businesses do better, people do better, communities do better, everybody does better. You can see the light bulbs go off in your head, like, oh, maybe it's not a bad idea to pay people a living wage, like who knew, right? So I think framing is really important, and I think that all of us here as advocates, we have to make sure that when you approach a issue and you have a solution for it, I think you have to think about how can this policy benefit everyone, and I think my colleagues here on the panel and the moderator as well have been mentioning, we need to talk about the bigger picture, not just the smaller, this benefits this group and this doesn't benefit this group. How can we benefit everyone? And really, sometimes the solutions are in front of us, it's just how we present it. Thank you.
Make it a round of applause for our panel. I want to open questions now to the floor. Just throw your hand up, ask a question to any individual panelist or to the full panel. We've got one over there.
Yeah, so I used to work at a food bank for a little over a year, and unfortunately I did see the same trend over the pandemic where there was a lot of influx of new clients who need to use it. So this is mainly directed to the people who are working with food banks. Like, how do you plan to accommodate like this ever increasing like growth? Like I know that it's like good that you're giving people food, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also in my mind like not a really sustainable way of combating food insecurity, because if you can claim that, oh, we can just send them to food banks, then they'll get food, right? Then people aren't gonna want to change the like problem because they'll say, oh, we already have like a solution, when that solution is really not, concrete. So what other actions are you doing like besides advocacy and like reaching out to politicians? Because I think that's a very good thing where you're trying to change the system at a higher level, because it is a very multifaceted problem.
That's a great question. I think I can tell you that we've done research on food banks and understanding the models of service at different food banks. And one of the things we found is that you're right, that people do, once people find a food bank that's local, that's close to them, that's accessible, they will keep coming. And that even if people's situation does get a little bit better, they're still coming. They still keep coming to us because they say, you know what? I can get food from the food bank, and that saves a little bit of my limited income to spend on other things. Why would I not come to the food bank anymore? Because now I have to buy food from my own pocket. So that's one thing. We have research on that. We've done it with a number of organizations telling us that people keep coming back to the food bank because the model is there. Now, does this mean that we want to make our model so bad and our service standards horrible so that nobody comes back? Absolutely not. And I agree with you that, you know, I can tell you that food bank, as I said, opened in the 80s as an emergency response. To this day, we still tell people, you only get 3 days worth of food every week. This is an emergency supply. This is not meant to be, replace your grocery. This is meant to supplement. So again, I think the framing is very important where people talk about if you're supplementing the groceries versus like replacing the groceries. And I think, you talk about what are some other ways, or you ask about what are some other ways that we can advocate for system change so that people don't have to come to the food bank. And I think, at the end of the day, I get really mad when I see a politician come to the food bank for a food sort or for a photo op. It's like, what are you doing here, Mr. and Mrs. Politician? You need to get back to the legislature or city hall and make policies so people don't have to come here. So I get very, mad about that. And I've made I've been outspoken at my own organization about letting politicians come in, do a food sort, get a photo op, and then leave. But obviously, I'm just one of many people in the organization. And what we try to do is build these working relationships with politicians to say, you know what, you come in and you see the reality on the ground, but how can you actually solve these issues? And I know politicians come in and they're like, oh, it's really sad that this food bank exists.
Right? Do something about it.
Exactly. So it's like, tell me about it, right? And I really think that, like, to answer your question, like, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think what it takes, my friend, is to build. I think we need public will to build political will. I think if enough people get mad about the situation that we're in, we can tell politicians and policymakers, hey, this is not okay. And you have a consensus, a critical mass, a public will that can drive political will. We know that nothing gets done in this country unless people speak out. And this is my last comment on this question, is that if you look at the example of the Greenbelt, everything that was going on in the Greenbelt, people got mad about it, people mobilized, people organized, and then the investigations came out. The journalists on the ground, if you support local journalism, you should support the local, you should support the Narwhal. These are local independent journalist organizations that put the pressure up. So that's why I think it's really important for us to, look at that example where the government felt the pressure on the Greenbelt, and they did a full 180 flip-flop on it. So that's why I was looking at it.
Could I just add, because I think what you said is really powerful, and I do think the framing, as you also mentioned earlier, is really important. And I also want to give kudos to One, because One has a great reputation of being able to work in a very respectful, positive way with politicians. So one way is to describe the issue in a way that a politician better understands, and what's in it for them if they're ready to vote on a new initiative. And just saying, well, that's the right thing to do, and it's wrong if we don't do that. That does not work. We've been told for years by politicians that nobody cares about international assistance. The problem is nobody knows how cheap Canada is when it is supposedly giving money away. A lot of Canadians say, we think what we provide in international assistance is probably about enough. But if you ask them how much that is, they don't know. They think it's much higher than it is. And so I think we need to be able to frame issues so that politicians can see the value of doing it. And we need people to understand and refute things that get said over and over again by politicians. Well, isn't it great we have a food bank to do this? No, it's not great. So those are the kinds of things I think we need to be doing as we try to make change. And part of it is about back to education, getting people to understand what the reality is that people are facing.
I want to share two things, an anecdote and then an observation, and then go back to another question. So one is one such politician who I know has done photo ops at food banks before. I had a meeting with recently a progressive city councillor who scoffed when I mentioned like the right to food might be something that we should talk about including in Toronto's food charter, which is like another languishing priority.
Yeah.
And I get into it.
Yeah.
So there is, I will say, like even just what Daily Bread is doing is like actually really out there in terms of what the political class is contemplating. Like they are light years behind. And the second to your question precisely is, so Amazon works with like about 120 organizations that could be understood as food banks. The vast majority of them, something like 60-70%, are engaged in some kind of like wraparound support provision. So in addition to just providing food, they're also providing access to other community resources like networks of mutual aid, support in finding affordable housing. So like this is a way that even within the context of the not-for-profit sector, which of course needs to be doing this deep advocacy, where we can also just be cultivating sort of, I don't know, relational networks of support and resource sharing and helping to, on the level of the individual, address some of the structural inputs towards food insecurity. That's not the answer to hunger, but it's part of a real deep harm reduction mindset.
Complementary.
Complementary,
right?
It's
And like we
complementary.
offer these information and referral, we call it INR, information and referral services, at our food bank. And we know that when people come in because the food is secure, they're also coming in because they don't have affordable housing, because they can't find a dentist, or they're facing like a legal issue, or et cetera, like the list goes on. So I think the INR, just speaks to that, like the wraparound services is very important, because food alone, somebody comes in because they're hungry, somebody comes in because they can't afford the food they need, but you know that they need something else.
And
I think
a lot of people will come in because of the food. And food is what gets people in the door.
Yeah.
And a lot of these community organizations, especially the smaller ones,
Exactly.
talk about it as being like,
And we get the service,
Yeah.
we get a lot of service organizations who come to us and say, you know what, we're trying to reach people, vulnerable population, and we know that vulnerable people come to the food bank. Vulnerable people don't go, may not go to hospital, they may not go to school. So in a way, you said this best, we're patching the holes in the safety net. Food banks are the final fail-safe of the social safety net. When all else fails, when income supports fail, when affordable housing does not exist, when healthcare is not affordable, transportation is expensive, people come to the food bank, because when people feel the pressure on everywhere else, it's the food bank. And that's why our numbers have quadrupled since COVID, because people are coming to us more and more and saying, I can't afford to live in this city. And frankly, that's the reality you're seeing. And I'm sorry, I just really appreciate the comment you made about the city council and the Toronto food charter, because I think that the limitations of city council is that municipalities have very limited levers available to them.
for sure.
And the city's broke. As you all know, there is a $1.5 billion deficit at City Hall, and it's very hard for them to really do anything because
they
of.
really want to do as little as possible right now. So,
Yes.
yeah.
And I think, sorry, my last comment, I think is that we should look to the province that is sitting on a surplus. And we should be doing advocacy at the provincial level, because we know that the provincial government has money, and we know that the city is broke, and we know that the federal government is facing, all sorts of pressures, all sorts of different debts and deficits and stuff. And we know right now that the money is sitting at Queen's Park, and I think we need to go get it.
Amen. In the front row here.
First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you, because this has been such an exceptional panel, and also thank you to GRAN, because thank you for putting this together, it's wonderful. And I'm wondering really about working together, because I do find that right now organizations are more or less working in silos, whereas you have like the food bank that's, more or less at this point a Band-Aid solution, something that you don't want to be there, versus like at SeedChange, for example, where you're working with like food security, food sovereignty, and really just changing the system. Do you think that we're working well